Chapter 33. The next morning, I lay in bed an hour before daylight, watching Hal's eyes and waiting for them to open. He was still asleep when the sun slipped over the trees, and I felt that I couldn't lie there much longer. I saw the lump of the wiener dog near his stomach. I picked a toothpick off the floor and tossed it at the lump. The dog rose under the covers and stuck her head out, and I looked around. Hal opened his eyes and stared at me. What are you looking at? Waiting for you to get up. What time is it? 30 minutes after daylight? Hal moaned and rolled over. We're going to do the chainsaw today, I reminded him. Why don't you go outside and help Daddy while I sleep? He up? Yeah, he's probably out in the clay pit. The wiener dog watched me for a few more seconds and then sighed and nosed her way back under the blanket. I pulled out my clothes and left to find Mr. Mitchell. I walked down the road to the clay pit as the sun rose over the pines, which were powdered orange 30 feet up from the clay dust. A hawk soared overhead, and a rabbit darted into the brush at the edge of the road. I hadn't gone far when I heard the clank of someone working on a piece of equipment. I rounded a bend in the road and saw Mr. Mitchell leaning under the hood of a front end loader. He wore greasy khaki khaki trousers and was barefoot and shirtless. I walked up behind him and watched him for a few seconds. Hey, I said. Mr. Mitchell jumped up and bonked his head on the underside of the hood. I didn't mean to scare you, he said. I could sneak up on just about anything without even meaning to. He climbed down from where he stood on the loader shovel, sat on the ground, and held the top of his head with both hands. I watched him rock back and forth, taking deep breaths. Finally, he looked up at me. Dang, Moon, he said. You need some help? He took one hand from the top of his head and studied it, then pushed himself up to stand again. He winced and went to lean against the front end loader. All right, he said. Why don't you go over to that shed and get me some oil? You know what that looks like? No, sir, but I can read. He nodded. Good. Go get me some that says 400. When I returned with the oil, he leaning under the leaning under the hood again. He reached back and I climbed up and put the oil into his hand. I've never seen an engine up close, I said. You're lucky. Looks like a bunch of parts. It is. How do you know what it all is? Because I've been running these for close to 25 years. I nodded. You gonna wash it? Gotta wash this thing. You gonna put some dirt in some people's trucks? Mr. Mitchell began pouring the oil into the engine. He looked at me while the can drained. Maybe, he said. It's Sunday, so might not be anybody until tomorrow. Where's that boy of mine? He's bedded down with the wiener dog. Mr. Mitchell spit in the side and shook his head. You got to twitching in there, didn't you? Yes, sir. Daybreak. I can't sleep much past daybreak unless I'm in jail where there aren't any windows. He looked at the old can and shook the last of it out. He tossed it into the weeds and shook the hood. I shut the hood. I climbed down after him and followed him to the shed, where we sat on 5-gallon buckets. Mr. Mitchell pulled some chewing tobacco from his pocket and packed his cheek full. I watched him work the wad around and spit out a long line of juice. You know what I can't figure, he said. I was watching the brown spit bead in the dust. I shook my head. Why your pappy wanted to live out in the woods like he did. He hated the government. What started all that business? I don't know. Your pappy have any friends? I shook my head. Only person we ever talked to after Mama died was Mr. Abiscato. He had the store up the road. He know your pappy for a long time? Yes, sir, I nodded. Ever since he went to live in the forest. Maybe he knows. I don't think he'd tell me anything. I whipped up on him pretty good. You ain't gonna whip up on me, are you? No, sir. I hope I'm done whipping up on people. Mr. Mitchell spit and chuckled to himself. I heard the dogs barking up the road and turned to see Hal coming towards us with the bloodhounds jumping up at him. When Hal stood before us, Mr. Mitchell suddenly leaped up and put him in a playful headlock. Hal began punching him in the stomach. Mr. Mitchell looked at me and smiled. It ain't nothing for me to find somebody to whip up on. Crap, Daddy, came Hal's muffled cry. Your underarm smells like horse pee. Mr. Mitchell let him go. Hal stumbled backwards, wiped at his face with his shirt, and spit at the ground. Then he looked up at me and laughed. Kick his butt, Moon. You boys go have some fun, Mr. Mitchell said. I'm going to give me a six-pack and sit up in that loader until I get buzzards roosting on me. It won't work, I said. Well, we'll see. We're going to get a chainsaw and go cut on some of those big trees that fell in the storm. Hal said, Moon ain't never used a chainsaw. By noon, we'd stack up a giant pile of tree parts. Hal sat in the branches of a large top and chewed tobacco while I busied myself inspecting an abandoned squirrel nest. Hal spit and asked me, anything in there? No, baby squirrels make good pets, though. I got I got enough pets already. I walked up the trunk to where Hal was and sat across from him. He held out a bag of Red Man chewing tobacco. You want some? Why would I want some of that? 'Cause it's good. I shook my head. Fine then, he said. Daddy left it in the truck. Your daddy lets you live just about any way you want, doesn't he? Hal shut his eyes and worked the tobacco in his cheek. Just about. Hal, what? Why you think my pap made me live like he did? I don't know. Your daddy said he can't figure it out either. Maybe some people were after him. He always thought the government was after him. Well, there you go. Why were they after him, though? Heck, Moon, I don't know. You ain't out there no more, so no sense in worrying about it. I could tell Hal didn't have any answers for me, so I laid back and we both napped under the pine needles. That night, I got a pencil and paper from Hal and wrote Pap a letter on the kitchen counter. Dear Pap, I know it's been a long time since I've written anything more than a couple of words to you. If you can see me, then you know where all I've been. You know I haven't had anything but pine bark to write on, and that doesn't make for an easy letter. Sometimes I wonder if you really get these words in the smoke, seeing as how I don't ever hear from you. I've made decisions that I don't know if you'll like. I decided not to go to Alaska at all if I've got to be alone. I don't think I can live like you wanted me to live. I think I'd be too lonely. Why did we have to live out there like we did, Pap? Why couldn't I have any friends? I'm gonna talk to Mr. Abiscato again. I don't know what to do. I'm not mad at you, Pap. Love, Moon. You got some matches, Hal? You can burn it on the stove. All right. Chapter 34. A couple of days later, Hal and I took the truck to get my things at the old shelter. Mr. Mitchell told us to drive into Union and head south to get to Gainesville. We'd pass through town, and then I start recognizing things. Your daddy doesn't mind you taking his truck out of here by yourself. I'm going to Helen Weller just as fast as I get caught driving as walking. You're not going to get caught. That's what you always say, and you've been caught at least once. They can't keep me, though. Hal laughed. We got laundry to do, too. Where are we going to do that? Laundromat? I've never been to a laundromat. You ain't never been lots of places. That's the place you told me they have a phone? Yeah, and they got good looking girls. I don't care about girls. I want to use that phone. We're going to call him. He hasn't been there that long. But they said he was okay, right? Yeah, I told you that already. He's okay. Good. I could tell we were getting close to where I used to live. He's the smell of the forest and the types of trees I was seeing. We're almost there, I said. You recognize all this? Yeah. It wasn't long before we came to the bridge over the Noxubee River. Stop right here, I said. Hal pulled over and I stared at me. I got out and scooted on my rear down the hill to the swamp. When I got to the bottom, I heard Hal yell at me from above. What do you want an old wheelbarrow for? Hal asked. It's mine. Sanders threw it down here. That the one you've been talking about? Yeah, the one I hauled my pap around in. Jesus, you need some help? No, I've got it. Let's just jab down in this mud pretty good. Finally managed to get the wheelbarrow out of the mud and drag it back up to the truck. Hal helped me put it in the bed, and then we set out again. A few miles down the road, I told him to pull over once more. This is it, I said. You wait here, and I'll be back in a little while. There ain't nothing here. I've got trails out there that I can take to the shelter. All right, how long's a little while to you? I shrugged my shoulders. That's what I figured. How about I go to the laundromat and come back? All right, I said. You can find me later. I bent over and picked up a stick. I stabbed it in the ground, right here. My feet fell quickly on the old footpath like I had just left the day before. I pictured what lay before me all the way to the shelter. Every crook in the path, low branch, rise and fall, gurgling creek. The patterns and sounds of the patch of forest where I lived for so long came back to me. I had run the trail so many times that I knew how firm the ground was before every step. I knew enough about what lived in the bushes and trees around me to tell the time of day by their movement and sounds. After an hour and a half, I was close to the shelter, yet I got the feeling that something was wrong. Somehow things were different, but I didn't know how. I slowed to a trot and finally took off my shoes and walked on the outsides of my feet. I approached the clearing and suddenly I knew that it was the forest noises that weren't right. A disturbance had passed through the left and left silence behind it. Scattered around the clearing were our tools and the few items of furniture Pap and I had in the shelter. The currying barrel was knocked over. Parts of the roof were pulled away. I walked slowly into the shelter and found it unusually bright inside from sunlight that beamed through the holes in the roof. The hide pile was thrown about the room, and a jar of nails lay shattered and spilled where the cupboard had been. Pap's books were in a soggy pile on the floor. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. I wasn't mad. I wasn't happy. I was confused. Remembering what I had come for, I felt around in the ceiling supports. My hand touched Pap's rifle. I pulled it from its hiding place and looked it over. It was in good shape except for a little rust on the barrel. I found our tube of grease on the floor and squeezed some onto a rag. I gave the rifle a rub down and then stepped back out of the shelter. I wasn't anything I could have done about this, Pap. I said out loud. I guess I'm not supposed to be here anyway. Supposed to be in Alaska by now. All I wanted was a rifle. I turned my back to the shelter and stepped into the forest once more. This time I took a path down through a cane thicket and across a stream where I used to run traps. I crossed a rusted barbed wire fence that Pat once said looked to be 100 years old by the way it was grown to the sides of the trees. I moved quickly through the hills and valleys and across Mr. Wellington's dirt road and back into the forest. After a while, I heard cars on the blacktop. I came out of the trees and continued the half mile to Mr. Abascato's store. I saw him through the window that looked over the gas pumps. His back was to me, and I knew that he was watching the television above the tobacco shelf. He didn't turn when I walked in, and the little bell jingled on the floor on the door. I stood there watching him and feeling nervous about how he would act. My hands were tired of holding the rifle, so I set the butt of it on the floor. I held it at the end of the barrel. Hey, I said. He turned and glanced at me briefly, then looked at me again and stood up. Moon? I nodded at him. That you? Yes, sir. He leaned over the counter and stared at me like he couldn't see very well. Hardly recognized you without your hair. I rubbed my head and nodded. Mr. Abascato looked like he didn't know what to do. Why don't you put up that gun? He said. You might take it from me. Why are you standing there and holding it like that? Because I was carrying it. Have you got it loaded? It's always loaded. I'm not comfortable with you standing there with a loaded rifle in my store. Think I'm going to shoot you? No, you're not. Are you? I've never shot anybody. I wouldn't shoot you, Mr. Abascato. He walked around the counter and came to stand before me. He was still watching me in a way that made me nervous. Set it over there by the door anyway. I glanced behind me, careful to keep him in sight, and saw a place near the door where I could lean the rifle and still be able to grab it quickly if I had to run out. I leaned it against the wall and faced my Abascato again. I wanted to ask about my Pat. You know how many people are looking for you? I know, Sanders is after me. Mr. Abascato nodded. He's in here at least twice a week asking if I've seen you. I think he tore up our old shelter. I just came from there. I'd have to think what he's gonna do when he gets his hands on you. You shouldn't mess with people like him. Maybe he won't catch me. After everything he says you did to him, he's gonna give it all he's got. You know, you could get me in trouble being here. I don't need any of his kind of trouble. That's why I'm standing by this door. You tried to turn me in once already. Mr. Abascal shook his head and stepped behind the counter. So you want to know about your father, do you? That's right. Why'd he bring me out here? He turned and looked at me and leaned against the tobacco shelf. Okay, why don't you sit down and I'll tell you what I know? I slipped down the wall to the floor. Moon, I didn't meet your father until you were about 2 years old. He just moved out into this forest, and he had you and your mother, Caroline, with him. They carried you around in a burlap sack with a piece of hemp rope, some kind of papoose setup. Neither one of them talked much. They'd told me what they wanted, trade a few things, and be gone. With me in the sack? That's right. Nobody knew where y'all went out in that forest. You'd think that after knowing your father all those years, I'd have some idea where it was you lived. But he was careful to cover his tracks, and I don't make a habit of getting into another man's business. Mr. Abiscato reached down, took a sip of cola that was on the counter. Anyhow, your father and I talked once after your mother died. He came in here with you late one afternoon as I was closing and sat down on the floor just like you're doing now. He told me that she was dead, that he'd buried her in the woods. I asked him if there was anything I could do, and he just shook his head. He was quiet for a long time. You never could tell what he wanted. That was the only time I thought maybe he was going to tell me something about himself. Finally, he asked me if I'd ever been in a war, and I said no. He said once you've been in a war, you don't need much to live. I took that to mean he'd gone to Vietnam, and something that happened to him over there made him want to live like he did. What happened to Vietnam? What happens in most wars? People get killed. However, a lot of people don't think we should have been over there. They made Pap go, and he didn't want to. Something like that. Is Sanders mad at Pap about Vietnam? No, I don't think. Why won't he leave me alone? You're starting to learn that life's not as simple as you thought it was, Moon. There's mean people out there. Sanders just has a bad streak in him. I told him a bunch of times I wasn't scared of him, and he's still after me. I know you're not scared of him. You're not scared of anything. You're screwed up, Moon. You're all messed up. You have no sense of reality. You've got to get some help. I stood and grabbed my rifle. Mr. Abiscato ducked behind the counter. Hey now, he yelled. I stood there with the rifle in my hands, watching the counter. Moon, he called out. What? What are you doing? Leaving. Mr. Abiscato peered slowly over the counter. I can tell you're not my friend, I said. I am your friend, Moon. I just know you need help. I'm trying to talk sense into your hard little head. You don't know anything about me, and I've known you longer than anybody except my pap. You know I wouldn't shoot at you. Mr. Abiscato shook his head. I'm sorry, he said. It's just that the news. I turned and left. I sat inside the edge of the forest for about 15 minutes before Hal pulled up near the stake I'd used as a marker. I stood and walked to the road, holding Pap's rifle. Hal watched me out of the truck window. What kind is it? 22. That all you wanted? I climbed into the truck and put the rifle behind between my legs. No, you best smash that gas pedal. What'd you do now? I went to that store. Mr. Abiscato is likely to have Sanders around here looking for me. Shoot, Hal said. He slammed down on the gas pedal and the tires threw dirt until they caught the asphalt and squealed. I wanted to ask him about Pat. I should have seen that coming. He said Vietnam made him want to live in the forest. You happy now? No. What happened in Vietnam? I don't know. Ask Daddy. I will. You know what else? What? Someone's been to my old shelter and torn it up. You mad about it? I shook my head. I don't care now. Nothing else there I needed. Hal turned the truck around and we headed back towards Union. He kept looking in the rearview mirror for a while, then relaxed. You hungry? He asked me. Yeah, you? We'll stop here at the lock and damn, I got some Vienna sausages and crackers. You okay? Yeah. Hal looked at me sideways. All right. We stopped at a point along the river where we could see the lock and sat on the tailgate. I pulled a sausage from the can and put it between two crackers and took a bite. Pretty good sausage, I said with my mouth full. Yeah, they're pretty good. What you want to do this afternoon? You know what I want to do. All right, we'll go call him. I swear I ain't taking you to visit everybody in the whole dang state.